Hi, my name is Susanne Kelder. I work in a Dutch telco and I used to work in a Belgian telco, where I was responsible for IT and network. I want to discuss with you today the context of outsourcing from a decision-making perspective. As a decision maker, if you start outsourcing or if you want to outsource a second generation, what are the questions you are going to ask yourself? What is your context? Basically, you start with why. What do I want to achieve? A lot of the times that has to do with operational costs, because somebody else can do it cheaper than you can do it. And a lot of the time it has to do with not just outsourcing, but also offshoring. Because in low labor countries, your labor costs are definitely a lot lower. And it's beneficial to offshore. Even if you lose a part of your efficiency and you make other costs to make up for the fact that you work distributed, it still is a lot cheaper. A second part has to do with improving quality. It could be that this is not a core activity and there are other partners for who it is a core activity and who can do this kind of work much better. They have people who are able to automate, who are able to do process improvements, or they have a lot of experience in certain part of the work. For example, managing software vendors. So it could be that that is the reason why you outsource to a certain partner. Another is, it leaves you free to focus on what you really need to do. If your strategic asset is to be very quick to the market, it might be that you need to focus on innovation or bringing new features live. Then it might be very helpful to outsource your operational activities, or so somebody else can take care of it. Those are basically things you need to ask on a board level before you start outsourcing. The second question I ask is, what am I exactly outsourcing? So this is what I want to achieve in the coming 3 to 5 years, but what exactly am I going to outsource? Am I going to ask my vendor to do this turnkey, so I can really take care of part of the business and say, okay, you manage this for me? And what interdependencies do you have? What are the boundaries between what the vendor is doing and your own organization? Can you do it turnkey? Or can you do it partly turnkey? How do you see interaction with, for example, technology vendors? This is one of the things from my experience that is a difficult one, because most technology vendors want to work directly with the customer. But if you ask somebody to manage your operations, you have to be very careful that you are not refereeing between vendors. So those are the things to really draw a plan on how should this work? What is this landscape going to look like? Who is going to do what? So where are the boundaries? Where do we say, okay, this is the handover part? You can do everything from turnkey to hiring your own resources and everything in between. That also makes it complex. You really have to look at, what is my context? What works, what doesn't work? Do I want a growth path or not? Those are things you have to consider and plan before you start discussing with vendors. Or do you do it partly together, so you can explore, this is what I want, but is there a vendor who can do it? Because if you are already in negotiation, everybody can do everything, or so they say. Then you really have to think about, how am I going to manage this? Because if you think 3 to 5 years ahead, how am I going to be sure that everybody is buying it? The first part, everybody is buying happily. It's like a marriage, everything looks great, you think they're fantastic, and then you start. And how do you make sure you're still enthusiastic about each other 5 years down the line? So you have to really think about, which KPIs do I want to steer on? Am I going to be successful if we reach those? That's something you really have to put on paper and discuss together. Also penalties and rewards. How do you make sure you actually make it work for you instead of against you? And then of course you have to think about, with whom am I going to do this? Am I going to invite a lot of vendors? Do I need a specific vendor? Is there a cultural fit or not? You really go into a vendor selection process. And one of the things that is often forgotten, which is really key, is to make a transformation plan for your own organization. Because if you change the demarcation lines, you change the way you do a contract. So let's say you're already outsourced and the first time the people really think, we need to change the way we steer a vendor. And that's something completely different from if you are steering your colleagues. There's really a difference. And you need to adapt your own organization and your own way of working. But also in a second generation outsourcing, you need to think about, what did I change? And how do I make sure that the organization, your own organization, is aware of the contract in a way that they don't micromanage the vendor? And if you do a turnkey, that they actually help and steer the vendor on the right outcome. For that, you also need a transformation plan internally. Because it's 3 to 5 years ahead, you have to really think about the different phases. And you need to think about that partly upfront. So how long am I going to take for a transition phase? How much can it cost? How much time and how am I going to do the transformation phase? So let's say you brought it to the vendor and we need to transform. How are you going to do that? There's also thinking about what are the most important things to do? What are they going to encounter? Because you already know. It's already been there for a long while and you need to openly discuss that with the vendor to make sure it's going to happen. Who's going to pay for it? That's also things you need to consider. It depends also on how did you construct your contract. And of course, you need to think about if it all goes wrong and if I need to retransition or I want to get out, how am I going to do that? It's one of the things you need to discuss upfront and you need to make agreements for upfront. It's a little bit like a marriage, when you make agreements upfront about a divorce. That's often easier to do when you are still good friends than that you actually have to do that when you divorce. One thing that I did not yet mention, but that's very important, are the legal aspects if you want to work in IT. One of the things is you have to consider data. Is the data allowed to leave the European Union? Do you have to keep it here? And there are requirements for personnel who can touch the data. Those are all things I experienced in my past, that there actually is data which is not allowed to leave the EU. And you have data where, for example, people have to be screened by national services. Well, that makes it a lot more complicated to outsource than if you can say, okay, I don't have those rules. So those are all things that you have to take into account when making decisions on outsourcing. A little wrap up. Think about the questions you need to ask on a board level before you start outsourcing, such as achievements, quality improvements, and focus. Make up your own plan with things such as context, boundaries, what works and what not. Do we need a growth path or not? And do we include a vendor in our plan making? Go from plan to reality and think of KPIs and penalties and rewards. And finally, plan for the different phases in your transformation, such as transition, the transformation itself, and think upfront about what to do when things go wrong.